My wife's coworker called me in the middle of the afternoon. Her voice was shaking, as if she didn't know if she was doing the right thing. She hesitated for a second before saying, "She's going to a dinner with the boss." My heart sank. Not because I was naive, not because I didn't want to see, but because I knew. I had known for weeks, maybe months, that something was wrong. But I never imagined it would be like this, so direct, so cruel, so cold. What hurt most was not the fact itself, but the place. The restaurant. Our restaurant. The one where I asked for your hand in marriage. Where we celebrated our 10-year wedding anniversary. Where, one December, she cried emotionally when she received the necklace that said, "Forever," as if this "forever" had any real value. I went there. I didn't think twice. I didn't hesitate. I parked the car like a madman, shaking, my jaw clenched, my heart racing and at the same time heavy, throbbing in every vein. I opened the restaurant door and saw them. There they were. Laughing. She with that laugh that she used only with me. His hand on the table. Her eyes shining in that way that I thought were mine. My world stopped. I walked to the table like a man who had just lost his ground. She saw me. The smile fell immediately. The color drained from his face. I approached. Her eyes were begging me not to make a scene. But I was already the scene. I looked at her, and said with my voice cracking with pain, "You are destroying our entire family. Congratulations on that. Now everyone will know who you really are." She tried to speak, tried to justify herself, but there was no room for words where only shrapnel remained. From then on, what was solid in me began to crumble. Memories invaded like sharp blades. The nights we spent awake dreaming about the future. The times she said no one knew me like she did. The oaths made under covers, hands clasped in the dark. How could someone who claimed to love me so much smile like that at another man? It wasn't just dinner. It was abandonment. Betrayal is not just physical. It's emotional, it's intimate, it's the slow murder of everything we've built. When she held his hand, it wasn't just the touch. It was the exclusion of my touch. It was the message that she no longer chose me. And he did it smiling. I came home like a ghost. I passed through the room, past the picture frames, past the pillow where she rested her head in my lap. I touched the sheet, still smelling of her, a perfume that now disgusted me. I sat in the dark for hours. Every thought was a stab. Every memory, a torture. Her words from past dinners came back with an echo, "I would never leave you, you're the only man I see when I walk into a place, it doesn't matter where, if it's with you, I'll go." Lies. Lies that taste like promises. I heard his laugh in the restaurant repeating in my head like a macabre mantra. She didn't just cheat. She erased me. Deleted me from within it as if I had never been someone important. And then came the divorce. Fast. Cold. No emotion. She didn't even fight. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg. He signed the papers with a slight tremor, perhaps more out of wounded pride than regret. I wanted to leave with the dignity of someone who believes they were right. He said he needed to rediscover himself. That, I was confused. That, it wasn't about me. But it was all about me. About who she chose to abandon. About who she would rather hurt than be honest. She didn't know, but her every silence in the process was a confirmation. Which she had already decided a long time ago. I was just the last to know. And that tore me apart. For weeks, I avoided our places. I couldn't bear to walk past the cinema where she cried at the end of some romantic film. The park where we took photos smiling as if time wouldn't pass. The coffee shop where she always ordered the same cake. But fate has no mercy. A month after the divorce was finalized, I decided to go to dinner. Alone. Or maybe not so alone anymore. I had accepted an invitation from a woman with whom I had been slowly talking. Something light, without pretension. I just needed air. Of new life. Of memories that didn't hurt. I chose a different restaurant. Or at least I thought it was. But when I looked around, I realized that we had already been there once, for her birthday lunch. I had an impulse to leave, but I decided to stay. And there, in that moment of almost giving up, she appeared. The woman I once called everything. Alone. Messy hair. Face without makeup. Scared eyes. She saw me. He saw that I wasn't alone. He saw that I actually laughed. That I looked at someone with sincere interest. For the first time, she was not the center. For the first time, she was the spectator. She stopped, frozen, as if she was waiting for me to get up, to run to her, to tell her I still loved her. But I just stared at her, calmly. A look that said, "You lost me." And that destroyed her more than any scream. She tried to smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. And then, he took a step back, as if understanding that he was too late. That night, for the first time since it all started, I slept peacefully. The pain was still there. The scar was still open. But I was no longer the same man. Not the one she left in pieces. It was another. One who had learned not to beg from someone who was capable of destroying everything for dinner. One who understood that sometimes, the greatest revenge is to simply move on. And let them watch. What did she do after seeing me with someone else? What happened to the lover she chose? And how did the woman who was having dinner with me that night come into my life for good? The answer is hidden in the choices she made, and in what she lost forever. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is supported or romanticized. All the stories you hear are fictitious, but inspired by situations real, with a single purpose, to show how betrayal can destroy homes, hearts and futures. Get ready. Next, you will hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Good story, and be ready to feel. Daniel and Laura looked like the couple everyone silently admired. There was something about the two of them that didn't scream perfection, but rather complicity. He was an architect, methodical, passionate about straight lines, the symmetry of concrete, and everything that could be built on a solid foundation. She, a graduate in administration, had worked for 8 years in a multinational and carried a lightness that was difficult to explain. Laura was the type of woman who seemed to know how to occupy spaces with delicacy and firmness at the same time. From the beginning, they had a routine that never got tired, a life that, to those closest to them, seemed balanced, with touches of love and respect that many only dreamed of living. They weren't extravagant, but they had charm in their simplicity. A couple who made small things seem big, a lazy breakfast on Sunday, a leisurely walk through the neighborhood streets, the custom of sharing a glass of wine at the end of every Friday. They lived in a 2-story house with a light facade and large windows, which Daniel had made a point of designing down to the smallest detail. It was his silent pride, the wooden beams on the living room ceiling, the floating staircase, the office on the mezzanine overlooking the back garden, where he spent hours immersed in his drawings, always to the sound of instrumental jazz. Laura loved that house not just for its architecture, but because it represented a dream built by both of them. She took care of the plants as if they were her children, and every corner of the house contained something chosen by her, a patterned cushion brought from a trip, a reading lamp inherited from her grandmother, books carefully lined up. Home was a reflection of who they were. And then, apparently, they always would be. They had celebrated 10 years of marriage that summer. They didn't have a party, or fancy dinners, they just traveled to the coast for 3 days, as they usually did on their most important birthdays. There were days of warm breezes, of conversations at sunset, of shared memories on the porch of a rented chalet. It was easy to believe they were okay. And they were. At least in the eyes of those on the outside. Daniel was a man with discreet but not cold gestures. He knew how to praise when necessary, he asked how her day was every night, he put his hand on her shoulder when she was tense. And Laura always knew how to welcome him, laugh at his little quirks, support his decisions, be a presence. He admired her in silence. She respected him. Both were filled with admiration, but like everything that repeats itself, the routine also began to take its toll. In recent months, Laura had taken on a new position within the company. An expected, deserved promotion, but one that brought with it new responsibilities, more meetings, more hours in the office and a silent pressure to always be available. Daniel, on the other hand, was immersed in an ambitious project, the renovation of a cultural center in the city, something he always dreamed of doing. With tight deadlines and a small team, I spent much of my time at the construction site or reviewing reports until late at night. Even though they shared the same house, they began to live in different zones. She woke up earlier. He slept later. The conversations became spaced out. The silences, longer. But nothing blatant. Nothing tragic. Just the subtle grinding of the gears of a royal wedding. Both noticed the distance, but tried not to name it. There was still affection in the touches, although more brief. There were still good morning kisses, even if hurried. And dinners at the table on Saturdays continued, although now quieter, often accompanied by a cell phone vibrating next to the plate. Daniel tried not to be bothered by the messages out of turn. Laura pretended not to notice when he was too absorbed to hear about his new leadership project at the company. Neither of them wanted to confront. Neither of them wanted to see that what they had before was changing. They thought it was just a phase. A turbulent period. Something that would soon pass. And perhaps it would even pass, if there was space and time for reconstruction. But time sometimes runs out before we realize it. Laura was always dedicated to her work, but there was something new in her attitude. More confident. More determined. A firmness that was accompanied by a strange elegance, as if she was discovering another version of herself. She started to take more care of her appearance, changing her office clothes for more sophisticated pieces, putting on makeup even on days without meetings. Daniel noticed, but didn't comment. He thought maybe she was just adapting to her new role. Laura said she was tired, but she seemed energized. She said the work was consuming her, but she seemed to live for it. Sometimes he would watch her from afar, sitting on the couch with the notebook on her lap, typing with her eyes alight, and he wondered if he was still part of what she called life. Despite this, Daniel was still present. I was planning a trip for the end of the year. I was thinking about renovating their room, changing the bed, painting one of the walls moss green, as she had suggested months ago. He prepared coffee for her on the days he woke up early, even if it was just to have it ready with a note next to it, "Good morning, my love." He believed that small gestures maintained the greatness of love. Laura, however, became increasingly distant from these details. When he noticed the coffee was ready, he responded with a kiss on the forehead, but his eyes were always hurried. When I received messages of affection, I responded with emojis. Sometimes I forgot to respond. The nights that used to be made up of conversations and movies became moments when she went up to her room early, claiming to be tired. And he would stay in the room, flipping through channels or rereading projects. Still, there were no arguments. There were no fights. It was polite distancing. A comfortable silence. As if they both knew, deep down, that they were losing each other, but didn't have the courage to stop the flow of things. And that was precisely what made everything more dangerous. There was no explicit pain. There was a peaceful emptiness. A decorated abyss. Daniel was never one to talk much about his feelings, but he felt it. I felt it every time she left for work and didn't look back. He felt it when she smiled at her cell phone, but not at him. He felt it when she said she was in meetings until late, but she came home with a perfume he didn't recognize. He didn't say anything. I preferred to believe it was just tiredness. That it was just him seeing too much. After all, she still kissed him. He was still sleeping next to her. He still called your name in the middle of the night, even if just to ask the time. But Daniel's heart, never one for fuss, began to carry a suspicious silence. In the midst of all this, there was one thing in common that still united them, their favorite restaurant. The one where they celebrated birthdays, small achievements, special nights. It wasn't the most expensive, nor the prettiest, but it was theirs. It was always there that difficult weeks ended, that they toasted life, that they laughed out loud. Over time, meetings there became rarer, but the place still held a strong memory among them. It was almost sacred. A reunion point. A neutral territory where everything seemed to work for a few hours. It was the only place where their eyes still met with some tenderness. So when Daniel walked into that restaurant one random afternoon, what he saw shattered something he was still trying to hold together. But that moment is yet to come. What is important, for now, is to understand that every story has roots. And theirs were deep, true, carefully constructed. Even stories that end in ruins, were once castles. Laura began to lose herself without realizing it. Mornings no longer had the same slow pace as before. There was a rush in his eyes, a restlessness in his hands, an almost constant urgency to leave the house. Daniel watched her from a certain distance, trying to understand at what point the days started to be dominated by notifications, busy schedules and conversations that always ended with, "We'll talk about it later." She didn't mean anything wrong, he thought. I was overwhelmed, it was obvious. And he respected that. He tried to maintain his balance, even if to do so he had to swallow a certain bitterness every time he saw the sparkle in her eyes directed at a screen, and not at him. At work, Laura had become an admired and feared figure. He knew how to position himself, conduct meetings with elegance, make quick decisions. Colleagues praised her, leadership recognized her. And there was someone who seemed to see her as more than just an efficient professional. Someone who listened to her, who laughed at the same things, who offered rides at the end of the day and coffee before meetings. A newly arrived, foreign executive, fluent in discreet charm and well-calculated words. He praised her in the details that Daniel no longer seemed to notice. The haircut, the way she conducted a presentation, even the way she adjusted her glasses to read a report. They were small gestures, but they slowly began to create space within her. A silent space, where dormant vanity was revived. Daniel, in turn, continued his precise routine. I designed, adjusted, remade calculations. I kept thinking about her, but I felt that if I said something, I would be complaining about something that might not even be real. Sometimes I would prepare dinner in an attempt to surprise her, but she would warn her that she wouldn't be able to make it in time. Other times, she would show up with flowers bought in a rush between meetings, as if trying to make up for nameless absences. And everything seemed to fit into a strange cycle of small attempts and great silences. He felt the distance increase, but pretended not to see it. She felt the guilt growing, but tried to numb it. One night, upon arriving home, Laura entered quietly and went straight to the bath. He left his cell phone on the kitchen counter without realizing it. Daniel, distracted by preparing something to eat, saw the screen light up and the name of a contact appear. A short but revealing notification. He didn't read the conversation, he didn't need to. One line was enough to transform certainties into doubts and trust into distrust. It hit him with the force of a forgotten memory. The heart raced, but the body froze. He kept his cell phone in the same place and said nothing. When she came downstairs, already in her pajamas, he smiled with an effort that hurt her without her realizing it. They slept side by side that night, but the bed felt like a desert. Over the next few days, Daniel became more introspective. He didn't confront, he didn't question. He just watched. I expected. He looked for some answer in her gestures. Laura noticed his look, but interpreted it as tiredness. I thought he was distant because of work, maybe bored. What she didn't know was that he was already beginning to map out the points of change, trying to understand the architecture of the lie that he now intuited, but still didn't have the courage to face head-on. One day, he decided to follow his instinct. Without warning, He showed up at her office with flowers and an invitation to have lunch together. I wanted to surprise her. But she wasn't there. They said she had left for an external meeting with the area director, a last-minute departure. Daniel thanked him, pretending to be natural, and left. Didn't call. Didn't send message. He just kept that information in his pocket, like someone starting to put together a puzzle. He arrived home early and spent hours sitting, mentally reviewing all the evidence he had previously ignored. And it all seemed to make sense. The delays, the vague excuses, the smiles that didn't reach him. The doubt that was previously unbearable was now almost certain. But still, it didn't explode. I still wanted to see it with my own eyes. Not for revenge. But to know how far it had gone. 2 days later, the phone rang. A feminine voice, familiar but hesitant. It was Laura's coworker. With nervousness in his voice, he said he needed to say something. I didn't want to get involved, but I thought what was happening was unfair. He said that Laura had left early saying she was going to a business dinner with her boss. But there was something strange about that story. The colleague knew that Laura was lying, and that bothered her. When he hung up, Daniel stood still for a few seconds, holding the phone with a shaking hand. Stomach in knots, mind spinning in circles. He took the car key and left without thinking much. The restaurant where everything would unfold was not just any place. It was theirs. The place where Laura laughed the loudest, where they celebrated their achievements. He entered with his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't have to look far. There they were. She smiled. Not with the smile of someone who is polite. It was a relaxed, intimate smile. The man in front of him looked comfortable, as if this wasn't the first time. Her hand on the wine glass, her gaze directed at him, the slight movement of leaning her body forward. Daniel stopped a few steps from the table. The ambient sound disappeared. Everything was silent, except for the racing sound of his own heart. She saw him. And the world stopped. The smile fell apart like a piece of porcelain breaking in slow motion. The face lost color. He approached slowly. The other man raised his eyebrows, surprised but not knowing exactly what to do. Daniel didn't scream. There was no scandal. He just positioned himself in front of her, his eyes staring like blades. The words came out with a firmness he didn't know he possessed. He said the phrase that had been pounding in his mind for days. He said it with each syllable carrying the weight of all the nights of silence. The people around looked. Laura remained static. The man tried to get up, but Daniel was already leaving. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about him and everything that had been broken there. That night, Laura returned home in silence. Daniel wasn't there. There was no message, no note, no farewell note. Just absence. He picked up his cell phone, read his unanswered messages from the last few days, felt his chest tighten. Tried to call. Without success. He sat on the couch and cried for the first time in a long time. Not because she was caught, but because she realized what she was missing. The house seemed strange, empty, as if it no longer belonged there. The plant in the room was dry, the "good morning" note crumpled in a trash can. Daniel, in turn, drove aimlessly for hours. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just breathed. Every time he took a breath, he felt the pain expand in his chest. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about everything he invested, what he built, what he believed. It was about time. About delivery. About how someone can lose themselves trying to keep someone else close. He parked in a random space, turned off the car and closed his eyes. He remembered the first time he saw her. From the first kiss. The promise that they would always be loyal to each other. And for a brief moment, he wished he had never loved so much. But that night still held more than he imagined. Something even bigger awaited him. Something he couldn't predict, and that would change everything forever. The morning was long and silent. Laura didn't sleep. She spent hours sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the closed door, waiting for him to return, for him to suddenly appear in the doorway and say something, anything, even if it was to scream. But nothing. The silence of absence was crueler than any words. She tried calling again, sent short messages, then long ones, then desperate ones. All ignored. The cell phone shook in her hands, but he didn't respond. Every minute seemed further away from him. The clock was showing 4 in the morning when she finally broke down into a silent, suffocated cry, hugging his pillow, as if she could extract from him some remnant of what once existed between them. The next morning, Daniel showed up at home. He didn't say where he had been, nor did he offer any explanations. He went in, picked up a suitcase and started putting on some clothes. Laura ran to him, her words coming out broken, trying to convince him to stay, saying that everything could be explained, that things had gotten out of control, that she was confused, that it wasn't what it seemed. But he didn't look her in the eye, he just continued, with a cold serenity, without anger, as if he didn't need to argue anymore. When she tried to grab his arm, he turned away with painful calm and said that at that moment he didn't want to understand, he just needed to get away from her. The following weeks were marked by silence and bureaucracy. Daniel filed for divorce. Laura signed. There were few words, no scandal, just the formal end of a story that was already falling apart inside. Mutual friends tried to give advice, family members divided sides, but no one knew what really happened behind the civilized facade. Daniel moved to a small apartment downtown. Sold the car. Changed phone number. He started going to cafes that he previously avoided. And between one afternoon and the next, he ended up approaching a woman he met by chance. Someone who knew nothing about his past, who laughed at his stories with genuine interest, who listened attentively and carried no memories of what he tried to forget. Laura, on the other hand, sank into loneliness. He kept his job, continued his responsibilities, but the shine disappeared. The man she was involved with left after the scandal was exposed. The relationship between them had never been promising, but at least it offered her an illusion of newness, of feeling desired. Now, there was nothing left. Just a house that was too big, too quiet. Her colleagues at work looked at her with different looks, and she started to leave early, avoiding unnecessary conversations. The nights became too long, and every object in the house seemed to accuse her of something. It was on a Friday, just over 2 months after the divorce, that Laura decided to do something thoughtless. A final attempt, a push between hope and despair. He discovered that Daniel had made a reservation at a restaurant. It wasn't what it used to be, but it was known for being a welcoming, romantic place. Waited. He wore a dress he liked. She tied her hair up like she did on her first dates. He arrived early, sat in the car across the street and waited. I wanted to see. I wanted to know if there was still something, if there was still room for her. And then she saw him. Getting out of the car with a serene calm, smiling. But he wasn't alone. She was walking next to a woman, who wore a simple dress, her hair loose, and had a sweetness in her eyes that Laura no longer recognized in herself. They both laughed. Daniel, in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't just company. It was lightness. It was a fresh start. Laura got out of the car as if she didn't know exactly what she was doing. He walked to the entrance of the restaurant, trying to look natural. And at that moment, he saw her. It stopped. Their eyes met for a second that seemed eternal. She smiled nervously, trying to look casual. He said he didn't expect to see him there. He just replied that the city was small. She swallowed hard and said she just wanted to talk for a few minutes. Daniel hesitated. The woman next to him, discreet, touched his arm and said she would wait in the car, making it clear that she would respect the moment. Laura took a deep breath. The hands were shaking. The eyes watered. He said he couldn't go on, that all he felt now was emptiness, that he was missed. Daniel remained silent, looking at her as if listening to someone speaking a foreign language. Then she apologized, for the betrayal, for the lies, for the absences, for the cowardice. He replied, in a low voice, that she didn't need to apologize to him. It was no longer about forgiveness. It was about not having anything left to rebuild. It was at that moment that Laura revealed what she had never said. Not as a justification, but as a confession. She took a deep breath, like someone holding something for too long. He said the dinner with his boss wasn't just an impulsive betrayal. She said that, weeks before, she had been called by the company's general director for a confidential conversation. An internal dispute was about to happen, and they wanted to replace him. Her name had come up among the possible successors. But there was one detail: they needed her to be completely in tune with the new leadership. And this dinner, which for Daniel was just the symbol of betrayal, was actually an informal celebration of the alignment between her and the new command. She had been promoted that night. But he didn't have the courage to tell him. Out of shame. Because he knew the price. He knew that, although there was no direct sale of his body, his emotional closeness to that man was used as political currency. He said he had believed he could control the situation, that the involvement would be nothing more than that. But it passed. And when he realized, he no longer knew how to get out without destroying everything. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her for a long time, as if he was digesting the revelation. He didn't scream. He didn't back down. He just said, in a tired voice, that now it made sense. Not the looks, not the excuses, but the emptiness. He said he always knew there was something more, something hidden. And as much as it hurt, he preferred that late truth to yet another subtle lie. Laura asked if there was still a chance. If he could consider, one day, returning. Daniel replied with painful calm that perhaps the cruelest thing about the whole story wasn't the fact that she got involved with someone else, but the fact that, in the end, she chose to lie. And that killed what was still sincere between them. He said that now he wanted to live another story. Not as a revenge, but as liberation. That she needed to look inside and understand what made her seek out what he always tried to offer. He turned and walked away, with firm steps, while Laura stood there, feeling for the first time the real weight of loneliness. And she realized that the true punishment for betrayal was not being discovered. It was losing someone who still loved her when she herself had already lost herself. Daniel didn't look back as he left Laura on the sidewalk. His steps were firm, but inside him a whirlwind stirred in silence. The smell of the night, the reflection of lights on the wet sidewalk, the muffled sound of distant traffic, everything seemed to happen in another reality, a parallel one, where he was just an observer of his own story. He got to the car, opened the door, sat down and rested his hands on the steering wheel without starting it. Inside, the silence was absolute. The woman who accompanied him watched through the window on the opposite side, respectfully. She realized that there was a pain that was not hers to touch, a memory that still took up too much space. He sighed deeply, turned his face and smiled, not lightly, but sincerely. He said he needed to drive, that he needed a road, distance, somewhere where he could breathe without feeling the weight of a decade slipping through his fingers. She nodded silently. During the journey, they talked little. Just enough. She understood that some pain needed to echo in the void before being replaced by words. The radio was playing some old, melancholic music softly, and Daniel didn't ask to change it. When they parked in front of his apartment, she lightly touched his arm and said she would be nearby, that there was no rush. He thanked her with a calm look, but filled with a certain abyss. Inside, Daniel walked to the living room, took off his shoes and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. He stayed there, static, for long minutes. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I just felt it. It was as if everything was slowly being dissolved within him. Betrayal was no longer the center. What devastated him was the revelation of the calculation behind it. Emotional use. The manipulation. The knowledge that he had been a silent pawn in a cold negotiation, where real feelings were treated as currency. It was eating him up inside. He had always prided himself on being an honest man, a direct, transparent man. Not out of moralism, but because he believed that the truth was the only solid basis possible. And now, he realized that everything he built had been negotiated for convenience. The next morning, he received an unexpected call. It was Laura's father. His voice was heavy, full of pauses, as if each word required effort. He wanted to meet Daniel. Not to convince him of anything, but because he needed to talk. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe on the east side. When Daniel arrived, the man was already there, with an untouched cup of tea. The red eyes betrayed sleepless nights. There were no formalities. He was direct. He said he knew everything, that Laura had confessed in tears, that he wasn't there to defend her. But I needed to say something. He said that, since she was a child, her daughter had always carried a silent desire to prove something. Not to others, but to herself. A concern for not only being the brilliant daughter, but the independent, admired, powerful woman. And that this ambition, although admirable, led her to make choices based on pride, not her heart. She said that as much as he loved her as a father, he was always afraid that one day she would cross the line between determination and ego. And now, I saw that it had finally happened. He apologized, not as a representative of his daughter, but as someone who saw in Daniel the son-in-law he never wanted to lose. He said he understood if he never wanted contact again, but that he needed to clear his conscience. Daniel listened to everything in silence, with his breath held back. When the man finished, he simply replied that he had no hatred. But I also had no hope. I just wanted distance. The man nodded and accepted. They shook hands without resentment, but also without a future. That same night, Laura showed up at Daniel's building. She was wet from the rain, without makeup, without a shield. The intercom rang and he answered. He just said he wanted to leave something. When she went upstairs, he didn't stop her from entering. He handed over an envelope and said that there was his resignation letter. That he had asked to leave the company. That he would give up his position, his promotion, his prestige. Not for him. But because he could no longer live with the type of woman he had become. He said he needed to start over for real. Daniel listened to everything with his arms crossed. She tried to smile. He said he didn't expect anything from him. No forgiveness. I just wanted him to know that she understood. That he now understood the extent of the damage he had caused. Daniel walked her to the door. Before she left, he said something that made her shiver. He said that the worst thing about betrayal is not the pain. It's the silence she leaves afterwards. The echo of everything that could have been. He said she taught him that. And that, despite everything, he wanted her to find some peace. She went down the stairs in silence, as if carrying on her shoulders all the ghosts she herself created. In the following days, Daniel decided to change apartments. Not because I didn't like it there, but because I needed new surroundings. He sold some furniture and donated others. He began to get involved in social projects linked to architecture. He taught at a community university. He rediscovered the pleasure of teaching. The woman he had met, Helena, remained present, but respected his pace. He didn't demand, he didn't pressure. He just walked alongside, offering company and silence when necessary. It was the kind of presence that doesn't occupy, but sustains. It was on a quiet afternoon, months later, that Daniel received a letter. He recognized the handwriting. It opened calmly, without anxiety. It was Laura's. A single sheet. A short text. He said he was fine, working with small consultancies, living in a nearby city. He said he thought about him every day, not just with regret, but with respect. And I would be grateful. For being who he was, for having loved the way he loved, for showing him what it was like to be looked at with truth. I didn't ask for a return. I didn't beg. Just thank you. And he wished that wherever he was at peace. Daniel folded the letter carefully. He kept it in a wooden box, along with some old photos, project notes and travel clippings. That box was now part of the past. A past he accepted. That he didn't want to erase, but he also didn't intend to revive. A past that finally stopped hurting. He went out for a walk. The day was clear, the wind was light. He met Helena in a cafe and they sat together. They ordered 2 coffees. They said little. But they smiled a lot. And in that smile there was something he no longer believed he could feel again, lightness. Not the euphoria of the beginning, but the serenity of someone who went through the storm, and chose to continue, with more truth, with more silence, with more self-love. And Laura? She also started over. Far away. No big promises, no idealized romances. He started writing. He started an anonymous blog, where he told fictional stories of people who lost love due to bad decisions. I never said it was her. But between the lines, she was in every line. Sometimes I cried while writing. Sometimes laugh. And each time, she was grateful that she had learned, too late for marriage, but early enough that she still had time to rebuild herself. Because pain, when faced with courage, also teaches. It also frees. And even if the love she destroyed never came back, she knew, that man, that love, had been the truest in her life. And that, as much as it hurt, was also, a form of peace. Laura moved on, at least from the outside. The routines changed, the faces around them changed, the contexts too. She started living in a small apartment, with wide windows that let in the late afternoon light. There were plants that he cared for with an almost religious dedication, books stacked in no order on the shelves, a kettle always on the stove. He spent most of his days in silence, writing, serving clients remotely, reviewing his past in thoughts that arose when the world slowed down. She no longer frequented the same places, nor took the same routes. He changed his habits, his schedule, his diet. She cut her hair, stopped dyeing it, wore simpler clothes, but there was something more truthful in every choice now. The mirror no longer reflected the woman from before, not the elegant, desired version, strategically positioned in the midst of corporate ambition, but someone who was learning to breathe on her own, without needing anyone's applause. The pain of loss, however, still lived inside her. And it was no longer the kind of pain that burns, that despairs, that implodes. It was a pain that settled. That settles between the ribs and transforms silence into reflection. I thought about Daniel a lot, especially on cold mornings, when the house seemed too big for someone who had already known the intimacy of a life together. There was something cruel about remembering the details that made up your days with him, the way he washed the dishes in silence, the notes left with haste and affection, the sound of his laughter during a movie. Things that once seemed small now gained the weight of a universe. But she no longer cultivated the illusion of a return. It was late. She knew. He knew that what he destroyed was irreversible. And acceptance, although painful, gave him some dignity. On the other side, Daniel seemed to have found a certain tranquility. Not that of films, where everything is resolved in a cinematic way, but an everyday peace, built with simple and conscious choices. Working with young architects kept him motivated. Involvement in social projects gave him a new sense of purpose. And, alongside Helena, a woman with a soft presence and sharp mind, she had built a space without pressure, without emotional dependencies, without games. A relationship that developed like a conversation that didn't need to be interrupted. They had differences. There were noises. But there was, above all, respect for each other's time. And that was enough. Even so, Daniel was not indifferent to what he experienced. He did not become cynical, nor did he shield himself completely. He kept within himself the marks of that old love, like someone who respects a scar that should not be touched, but also should not be forgotten. Sometimes, in moments of introspection, I would take out the wooden box where I kept Laura's letter and the records of what they had experienced. Not to dwell on the past, but to remind yourself of what survived after it. It was as if, upon reviewing that closed chapter, he reconnected with the part of himself that had been lost in the chaos, but which now served as the foundation for everything he had been building. The dilemma, however, still presented itself in the form of a silent crossroads. Because Laura, by transforming her pain into literature, began to attract attention. His texts, initially anonymous, began to be shared. Fictional stories, but visibly full of real experience. Women saw themselves in those words. Men too. People wrote thanking him, moved, saying that they had been saved by his honest, raw, painful narratives. She started to be invited to events, reading circles, interviews. And, even without revealing his identity, he became a reference. But anonymity was a fragile cloak. And one autumn afternoon, a former coworker, who had been following her texts without knowing they were coming from her, called and said with surprise, "I read something today that made me think of you. It's almost like it was about the two of you." Laura froze. That was inevitable. Recognition, exposure, revelation. Her story was no longer just hers. It had become a symbol for other pains, for other broken hearts. And with that, the doubt arose, how far was it fair to continue telling that story? Was he turning his guilt into redemption? Was he unconsciously trying to erase the harm he caused through nice words? Or was he just telling the truth, even if late, even if disguised? It was a fine line. And on the other side of that line, perhaps there was Daniel. He also heard about the texts. He didn't read them right away. I found out about them from Helena, who found them by chance in a digital magazine and, without knowing who they were, commented on how that author wrote with brutal honesty. When she read one of the passages out loud, Daniel felt goosebumps. You knew. It was impossible not to recognize it. That phrase, that way of constructing feelings, was hers. He asked for the link and read it in silence throughout the night, one text after another. And, in the end, he felt something he didn't expect, compassion. There was no romanticization. There was no attempt to clean up. There was shame. There was guilt. There was learning. And he understood that she was trying to give something back to the world that would somehow make up for the void she had caused. But doubt grew within him like a seed. Should I respond? Should I look? Should I recognize it? Or would silence be the last gesture of respect? Helena noticed the change in his eyes in the following days. He touched on the subject delicately, but bluntly. He said he understood. That it was part of his story. And that, if he needed to end this part of his life with one last period, it wouldn't be an obstacle. Daniel thanked him silently. He knew he had someone at his side who didn't demand proof or guarantees, just the truth. He didn't respond immediately. It took days to make a decision. And he decided he wouldn't talk to Laura directly. Wrote a letter. Brief. Direct. He said he had read it. That he had understood. That he was at peace. And that she should keep writing. Because perhaps, in doing so, she was making sense of what was once pain. He said he didn't want a reunion. No conversations. But he forgave her. Not because she asked. But because he needed to walk lightly. Signed with your name. No date. No address. Just send it to the blog's email, like any other reader. And I never knew if she received it. And I didn't want to know. Laura, upon seeing the message, took a while to open it. When he read it, he cried. Not of guilt. Not of hope. He cried because he felt that, finally, there was an end. Not the end of love, but the end of pain. She responded with a text, not directed at him, but published on the blog. It talked about when stories no longer need continuity. When everything has been said. When silence does not hurt, but welcomes. And that day, he closed his laptop with a slight smile. Life went on. Both found new paths. New people. New ways of existing. But their story, with all its beauty and tragedy, remained there, intact in time. Not to be relived, but to remember that some losses are inevitable. And that some truths, even painful ones, free us more than any well-intentioned lie. And in the midst of all this, the dilemma remains: to what extent are we responsible for the pain we cause in others? And is it possible, one day, to redeem ourselves without it meaning erasing what we were? Perhaps the end is not in the answers, but in the way we choose to move forward after facing them. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came cloudy days, the biting wind and the smell of burning wood spread through the streets. Daniel had finished renovating a community space in the neighborhood where he grew up, a project that brought together young people in vulnerable situations with professionals from different areas. It was a living center of culture, ideas, and belonging. He spent most of his days there, giving workshops, guiding groups of students, getting involved in decisions that went beyond concrete and beams. At night, he used to walk to his favorite bookstore, where he sometimes read excerpts aloud to a small group of listeners. Helena remained at his side, with the same lightness. They didn't call what they had dating. It was a bond built slowly, almost without definition, but with the security of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Still, something in Daniel was in transition, as if the past hadn't yet been fully digested, although it no longer hurt in the same way. One night when the bookstore was promoting a party for independent authors, Daniel was surprised to hear a familiar text being read by an unknown voice. The text was hers. He recognized the structure, the rhythm, the choice of words. He looked around carefully, trying to locate a face from the past among those present, but he didn't see Laura. After the event, he approached the person responsible for the soiree and asked if she knew the author of the text. The woman smiled sympathetically and replied that she did not know her personally, that the text had been sent anonymously by a reader, and that the name used was fictitious. Daniel thanked him, but felt something strange form inside him. An discomfort that wasn't pain, but rather the suspicion that perhaps that story, which he thought closed, was still moving silently along the margins of his life. Laura, at that same time, was in a simple house in the country. She had been invited by an NGO to lead a therapeutic writing workshop with women victims of abusive relationships. She did not present herself as an expert, nor as an author. She just shared paths she learned by walking alone. Sitting on the wooden floor, surrounded by cushions and mugs of tea, she read stories and listened to confessions. I noticed, in every look, the urgency of the outburst, the weight of the silence accumulated over years. There, she was not judged for who she was, nor seen as a woman who once cheated. He was just someone who spoke honestly. And that was more than enough. That night, after the conversation circle ended, a lady approached her and said she wanted to thank her. Not through the words, but through the silence between them. He said that only someone who had actually experienced profound loss knew the value of a pause in the middle of a sentence. Laura smiled with teary eyes, and that phrase echoed in her for days. He returned home the next day and found, among the accumulated emails, a message with a simple title, "I heard you." The sender was unknown, but when he opened it, he immediately recognized the voice behind the words. It was Daniel. He didn't talk about love or longing. Just thank you. He said that listening to her had made sense. That, although the story between them had ended, the truths that she now sincerely delivered to the world deserved to be heard. Laura closed the computer and passed her hand over her eyes. That message did not rekindle hope, but it definitively ended a cycle. Days later, Laura was invited to participate in a live interview on an independent channel about literature and overcoming. The invitation took her by surprise. He still resisted the idea of showing up, of exposing himself more than he already exposed himself through words. But something in her told her it was time. That, perhaps, facing the world with your face uncovered was the last step to, finally, moving forward. Accepted. On the night of the broadcast, he was wearing something simple. Her hair tied into a low bun, her skin clean, her eyes tired but attentive. During the conversation, he talked about writing, about mistakes, about choices. At one point, the presenter, without knowing the story behind the guest, asked if she believed that someone who cheats can be forgiven. She smiled, swallowed the silence for a second and answered honestly that true forgiveness does not depend on the other person. The hardest thing is when we need to forgive ourselves for what we chose, even though we know we could have done differently. And that, sometimes, the forgiveness that frees is the one that we do not receive, but offer ourselves. The repercussion was intense. Social media was flooded with messages from people touched by the interview. Many saw themselves in her. Others were outraged. But, above all, there was a current of humanity being generated. She was approached by publishers. Received lecture proposals. And, one rainy morning, while drinking coffee looking out the window, he realized that he had found a purpose again. She wasn't the woman she was before. I didn't want to be. It was another. More whole. More raw. More alive. Daniel found out about the interview through a student who sent him the link. Didn't watch it right away. He kept the video for days until, one Sunday night, alone at home, he decided to watch it. He watched in silence, from beginning to end. He watched not just what she said, but how she said it. The tone of voice, the pause between sentences, the eyes that carried something different from what he once knew. At the end, he felt a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. I knew this was real closure. There were no more loose ends, no more blank spaces. She was following. And so does he. The following week, Daniel and Helena traveled to a small coastal town, where they would spend a few days away from everything. They walked along the sand, listened to the sea in silence, shared old stories that had never been told. One night when they were having dinner at a seaside restaurant, Helena held his hand and asked if he still carried something that prevented him from loving fully. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at the dark sea ahead, as if searching for an answer in the waves, and then said no. That everything that needed to be felt had already been. That pain, memories and guilt had been respected, processed and released. He said there was now space. New, clean space, possible. And she smiled, not like someone who conquers, but like someone who welcomes. Meanwhile, Laura, in her apartment lit by yellow light, wrote the last chapter of the book that brought together her most intense chronicles. As he typed the last line, he realized he wasn't crying. For the first time, a story ended with peace. He saved the file, closed the computer and opened the window. The street was silent. The leaves swayed in the light night wind. He took a deep breath. And she felt she was ready. Not to start over, because it had already started over. But to live without the need to prove anything. Just exist. Just feel. As she finished packing her suitcase for a small trip she would take alone to a silent retreat, she looked at an old photo left on top of the bookshelf. She and Daniel, smiling, on an autumn afternoon many years ago. He took the photo delicately, looked at it for long seconds and put it inside a book. Then he turned off the light, picked up his suitcase, closed the door and went downstairs in silence. The night was cold. But inside it, finally, it was sunny. It was a calm Monday morning when Daniel arrived at the cultural center where he taught, carrying a cardboard box with new materials for that day's workshop. He was wearing a light shirt, clean-shaven, his hair a little grayer than months before, but with a serene air, a good tiredness in the eyes of someone who was where he wanted to be. Upon entering the room, he was greeted with hugs and smiles from the young people who were already waiting for him. Those faces, full of possibilities, had become his new family. Each project delivered, each progress he saw in the hands of those students was, in a way, an intimate redemption, a reminder that his story had not ended when he was broken from within, but had begun again. There, he felt whole. In peace. On weekends, I traveled with Helena, discovered new places, and relearned what it was like to share moments with someone who demanded nothing more than their presence. He never got to call it love, because what they had was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was partnership, it was relief, it was affection without artifice. One day, as they were walking through a flower field during a short trip, she stopped and said that she didn't know what the future would bring, but that if he decided to stay, she would go with him without hesitation. Daniel didn't respond with words. He just held her firmly by the hand and continued walking. That, for both of them, was more than enough. Meanwhile, Laura returned from the silent retreat. The days there had shown her things she hadn't been ready to face before. For the first time, I didn't feel guilt or anxiety. I just understood that there was a right time for everything. And hers now was to build something new with her own hands, without the shortcuts she previously sought to feel valid. She began organizing face-to-face meetings with women who identified with her texts. She created a network that, in a short time, grew beyond what she imagined. She received letters and messages from all corners, from people who found comfort in her words, in her failures, in the flawed and honest journey that she never tried to hide again. An invitation to publish his first book came from a renowned publisher, and with it the chance to make his pain a collective instrument of transformation. Accepted. And on the night of the launch, sitting in front of an attentive audience, she read the preface in a firm voice. She was no longer the woman who used words to hide. Now every sentence was an open door. In the back of the room, watching silently, was someone she hadn't expected to see. Helena, sitting discreetly next to a shelf of books, smiled when their eyes met. After the event, Laura walked up to her, and the two greeted each other respectfully. Helena praised the book and said that it took courage to transform flaws into power. Laura thanked him and, with the humility that only pain can teach, asked if Daniel was okay. Helena replied yes, but without giving details. The conversation lasted just a few minutes, but both knew that in that brief meeting there was an unspoken agreement: Daniel's story no longer needed to involve Laura. Their past was contained there, with respect, but without the need for proximity. It was the end of a chapter, finally accepted by all parties. Shortly afterwards, Laura received a simple, handwritten letter. It was from a young woman called Beatrice, who said she found the blog on a difficult night. She claimed that the words there prevented her from making a decision that could have destroyed her. She said she felt seen, understood, guided by someone who knew how to go down to the bottom and return with something true. Laura read the letter countless times. He kept it inside the newly published book and, that night, he wrote his last text for the blog. He said it was now time to close that cycle. That the stories told there had fulfilled their role. And that, sometimes, the most beautiful way to continue is to know how to stop. Daniel, upon learning of the end of the blog, felt a silent knot in his chest. Not out of nostalgia, but out of understanding that Laura, in her own way, had made peace with what she caused. And that what they built, even with ruins, had left something good in the world. He continued with his projects, now with an invitation to lead a team in another country. Helena supported him from the first moment. And the night they decided to pack their bags together, he looked at her as if he knew that, this time, he was going to take everything that mattered. There were no more old photos, locked boxes, memories that weighed down. Just the present, whole. And so, the two continued. In different directions, yes. But no more emotional debt. The love that once brought them together left traces, scars and learning. And each one, in their own way, found what they were looking for, not the perfection of a happy ending, but the maturity of an honest ending. Because in the end, perhaps the greatest justice that time offers us is not return, but clarity. The chance to live without pending issues, without masks, without illusions. The chance to, even after the chaos, be someone better. Now, tell me. What did you think of this story? Which character moved you the most? Comment below, I really want to know your opinion. And of course, if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more intense stories like this. Here we don't romanticize betrayal. We show how it hurts, destroys and leaves deep scars. Because those who cheat don't make a mistake, they make a choice. Until next time.